This is week 4 of our Sunday night sermon series through the 8th chapter of Luke's Gospel. And in the first week, we looked at the first 3 verses of Luke chapter 8 and focused on what is the activity of Jesus' ministry and who are the people who are with him, focusing on those other disciples besides the 12 that we have named. Luke includes the names of women who are also Jesus' disciples, supporting his ministry, with him in ministry, but giving of their own financial means to support the proclaiming of the kingdom of God. Then the next week after that, we looked at teaching discourse of Jesus, focused on parables, and we asked the question, how is your listening? How are we listening? Looking at the statement that Jesus said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Meaning that because of who Jesus is, when he speaks, when he teaches, it's not just pay attention, but it's also we need to respond to the message. When the word of the Lord, when the gospel is preached to us, it's not just, oh, that's nice. It's how do we respond to it? Jesus' words cause us to respond. That is our appropriate action when we hear them. And then last week, we looked at the unique and total authority of Jesus through 2 separate episodes, the calming of a storm and the casting out of a legion of demons. Now this week, we are going to do part 2 of that because Luke in the 8th chapter, the second half of his chapter, strings together 4 different episodes that demonstrate the total and unique authority of Jesus. So today's message is the authority of Jesus, part 2. And we are, again, going to dive in to the fact that Jesus has unique authority and that no one else has this kind of authority. It is unique to Jesus and him alone. But it's also total. It covers every aspect and area of our lives and creation itself. Last week we saw that Jesus has authority over the creation, but also the spiritual world. So the physical world and the spiritual world, Jesus' authority over them is total and unique. Today, we're going to finish out chapter 8. We're going to be reading verses 40 through 56, but we're going to start just by reading verses 40 through 42. Hopefully, you've got your Bible open to Luke chapter 8 at this point, and you are going to follow along. I strongly encourage you to do that. So, starting in verse 40, it says, "And as Jesus returned, the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. And there came a man called Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue. And he fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house. For he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him." Now in verse 40, when it says that Jesus returned, he's come back to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, of that large body of water. And he has come from the region of the Gerasenes, and he's come back to where he was before, and everyone is waiting on him. And so we see this crowd that is welcoming Jesus. And pushing his way through this crowd, we see this individual named Jairus. It calls him an official of the synagogue. What this probably means is that their local synagogue, he's probably in charge of the facility itself. So he would be a prominent member in the community, but he's got a need. His daughter, his only daughter, is sick. And he asks Jesus to come and heal his daughter. So Jesus begins, they start making their way through this crowd, pushing their way through the crowd to go to Jairus' house. Now we pick up in verse 43. It says, "And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, and who could not be healed by anyone, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me." And when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." We see here that this is a story within a story. We need to pay attention because there's a reason that these are included this way. Now, Mark, in his account of this story, because this account, these healings are included in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which people call the synoptic gospels because they're so similar. They share so much of the same content. Synoptic just means they look alike. So in Mark's account, Mark gives us a few extra details into who this woman is. We don't know her name. She remains anonymous, but we learn a little bit more of her story. In Mark chapter 5, verses 25 and 26, Mark tells us that it's not only that she's had this issue, she's been bleeding for 12 years, it's that she has, not just that she hasn't been able to get well, but that she's spent everything she has. She has poured all of her resources into different doctors and physicians seeking different cures to heal her of her remedy, but she hasn't gotten any better. In fact, she's gotten worse, and she's lost everything that she has. So we see here that she's got this health problem, this chronic health problem that, while she's still living, is a constant nuisance and a constant reminder that she is not whole. She's not as she should be. And those of us who either have chronic health problems or have family members or close friends with chronic health problems can testify to the fact that having a chronic problem, while you might be able to continue living and do some of the things you want to do, is a constant drain. It wears on your soul, especially after 12 years. But it's not only that she had a health problem, she had a social problem as well. Because she's bleeding, she is ritually unclean. That means that if she goes to the synagogue, whatever she touches will be unclean. She will contaminate whatever she interacts with. If she touches another person, she'll make that person unclean. If you go into her home, you will become unclean. If she comes into your home will become unclean. Now, in the law, if we look back in the Old Testament, there are ways to cleanse that. Remedies, different rituals, waiting periods to become clean again. But because she is bleeding continually, none of those rituals or remedies are going to help her. She's constantly in a state of uncleanness. And so that has probably affected her ability to have friends and to visit with people and to interact. But she also has a spiritual problem because she can't go to the synagogue, because she's unclean. She can't take place in community worship, in community prayer. She can't hear the words of the Old Testament scrolls being read because she would make everything unclean. And so she is probably experiencing social distancing. But for 12 years, because everybody knows, right? Because she's spent all this money trying to get well, so this is not a secret thing. So we, for a couple months, have been feeling the effects of what it's like to have to remain distant from each other. Just yesterday, my family, my sisters and I, and my dad, we finally all got together. There's 12 grandkids in total, and we finally all got together after 2 months of not seeing each other. And the kids all went crazy with their cousins. I mean, they were so happy and excited and elated to be together, and it just felt good to be together again. But she has suffered for 12 years. Imagine that. But she is faith on display. She hears Jesus is here, and she winds her way in through this very public scene, this very public setting, and she says, if I can just get close enough to Jesus, I know I will be healed. And so she risks it. She takes a courageous step of faith here. Now, in reading this account, verse 46 is curious because it says, and Jesus said, someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me. So she is healed as she just touches the hem of his cloak, or maybe the fringe of his cloak. It's not that Jesus saw her and was like, you need to be healed, be healed. It's that she came up and then she was just kind of like automatically healed. What do we make out of verse 46? And honestly, when I was digging through commentaries and looking at notes and seeing what other scholars, I'm not a scholar, what scholars had to say, no one really comments on verse 46. No one really goes into a lot of detail. And so I felt a little like, I want to know, what is the significance of verse 46? And then, so I was praying through that, and then I was pondering it, and I just feel like the Spirit brought back into my mind just the simplest Christian truth, is that faith is the avenue for God's healing. Faith is the avenue for salvation. Faith is the conduit through which God moves. We're saved by grace through faith. Faith is the atmosphere for the movement and the working of God. God, he works on faith. And so when this woman who was full of faith, in my opinion, came near to Jesus, she had to be healed. She couldn't not be healed because that is how God works. That's how God designed it, to work through faith. And this woman's healing was holistic. It was not just that God met her physical need, because if we look back to what Jesus said to her, he started out with the word daughter. And where I'm actually going to read out of Mark's account, because Mark, again, gives us an extra detail. So in Mark 5:34, this is what Jesus said to her. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Now, Mark adds on that be healed of your affliction tag on the end of Jesus' statement. And so from here, we can see that her healing is holistic because Jesus has met all her needs and he's addressed them in his statement to her. So imagine this. There's this crowd everywhere, and everyone's jostling and everyone's pushing and everyone's trying to get next to Jesus. Jairus is saying, we need to go to my house. My daughter is dying. You said you would heal her. And Jesus takes the time to look for this woman. She realizes she's not escaped notice. She reveals herself to him, and then Jesus takes the time, and I think from his words, it is appropriate to conclude that he got down on her level, that he looked her in the eye, and he said, daughter. Now, this is a woman who has been experiencing social distancing, who may have been ostracized, who has not been able to do all the things that she wants to do, has even been cut off from her community of faith, and he called her a daughter. He said, welcome to the family. You are a part of our family. We accept you. You are loved. You have a place and a position. You matter. Those are powerful words. And sometimes, just as a side note, people who are walking through things, especially chronic diseases, chronic illnesses, chronic maladies, they need to hear words like that. They need to hear, you matter. You are important. You are loved because I see you for you. You are a person and you are important and you are a part of things. Now, back to Jesus and this woman. He calls her a daughter. He says, your faith has made you well. God works through faith. You put your faith in the right person. That has made you well. She knows that physically she's healed. And he says, go in peace. So, shalom, have peace, calm, your anxieties, they need to fade away. Your worries are gone. You can be still. Just like he calmed the storm, just like he cast out that demon, and we saw the man who was possessed by that legion of demons being calm and in his right mind, he has given peace to this woman. And he says, be healed of your affliction. You're no longer afflicted. That social malady, affliction, is now gone. He has given her holistic healing, and he has spoken these words so that she will know all the ramifications. And this is taking place in public so that everybody will know. She is no longer unclean. She is clean because I have made her clean, and she is part of the family. She is to be accepted. Now, not only do we see the unique and total authority of Jesus on the display here, but Jairus is still there, right? He's like, what? And we need to remember here that this is a story within a story. And whenever we see a story within a story, we're looking at that second story, and that helps us interpret the first original story that we're going to go back to. So Jairus has something to learn from this woman. Now, as we get back into Luke chapter 8, continuing on with the narrative, in verse 49, we read this. It says, while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. But when Jesus heard this, he answered him, do not be afraid any longer, only believe, and she will be made well. Now, before we get into the significance of those words, if you are familiar with each of the gospel accounts of this story, you might be wondering, what about Matthew's account? Because Matthew's account is much shorter, it is very condensed, and it does not include a lot of these details. In Matthew 9, 18 through 26, we see this story of Jairus and this woman who had the issue of blood play out. But Matthew does not include all these details. For example, in Matthew, Jairus comes to Jesus and he says that his daughter is already dead. Not that she is dying, but that she has already died. And there are no servants who come from his house in the middle of the journey to inform him. So what do we do with that? Are these different accounts? Did they just get it wrong and mixed up? Do we have some errors and mistakes here? No, we have Matthew utilizing a literary device. It's called telescoping. He has condensed the narrative down to its essentials. Because Matthew includes this in a different setting in his gospel account. Remember, the gospel writers are not concerned with chronological precision accuracy like we are today. They are more concerned with themes and making points. And they arrange their accounts purposely to focus on communicating certain themes, certain ideas, making certain theological points. They do it on purpose. And so if Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all reading their accounts, they would be like, yeah, what's the big deal? Matthew would be like, clearly I'm emphasizing. And Luke would be like, well, clearly Matthew is, but I wanted to draw. And Mark would be like, yeah, but it's all the same. It's all the same. So we can see that that's what Matthew's done. He's condensed the story down to its essentials. Now, back to Jesus' response to Jairus. He tells him, no longer be afraid, only believe. So this is what Jairus can learn from this woman who has just been healed. She has been filled with faith. And even though Jairus just received this account, your daughter died. Your daughter that you loved and you came to Jesus for, she's dead. It's over. Like, you don't need to bother Jesus anymore. There's nothing more that anyone can do. Jesus says, don't be afraid, only believe. Faith, because you can't be filled with fear and faith. It's one or the other. You cannot simultaneously be filled with both. They're mutually exclusive. Now, it doesn't mean you can't feel some fear. So being afraid is different from feeling some fear. When we feel some fear, that's when our faith kicks in and it says, okay, I acknowledge that I feel a little fear, but I'm full of faith, and I put my faith on Jesus Christ, who has unique and total authority. So I'm going to tell you, fear, that I'm full of faith, and I'm reminding myself that I put my faith in Jesus, and I'm going to walk forward in that. So fear, you are dismissed. Whereas if we chose to then be afraid and fill ourselves with fear, we would say, yeah, Jesus can't do anything. This is the worst possible scenario. This is what I didn't want to happen. I guess I'm stuck here. Why would he do anything special for me anyway? No, Jesus says, only believe, because faith is only as good as its object. Faith in just this vague notion of faith is useless. Faith is only as good as its object. And Jesus can say, only believe, because he is the most qualified and most worthy object of our faith. Why? Because he has total and unique authority. He's demonstrated that he has authority over the storms and the seas, over physical creation. And he has authority over the spiritual world, that even a legion of demons cannot stand against him. Now that he has authority over an illness that no doctor on earth can cure. He's got authority over our diseases and our illnesses and our maladies. And now he is saying, so you only need to believe. Fill yourself with faith. Cling to the faith in me, because I am the object that is worthy of that faith. The woman with the hemorrhage demonstrated this. Now, as we keep going in verses 51 through 56, it says, when Jesus came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter, John, and James, the girl's father and mother. Now they were all weeping and lamenting for her, but Jesus said, stop weeping, for she has not died, but is asleep. And they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. He, however, took her by the hand and called, saying, child, arise. And her spirit returned, and she got up immediately, and he gave orders for something to be given her to eat. Her parents were amazed, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. They arrive at Jairus' house. Now the professional mourners, relatives, they're all there, and they're fulfilling their social obligations. They're wailing. There are musicians there. This is the way that they mourned, and they're causing a big commotion because that's what you did. And Jesus puts them all out of the house. Now, Luke, when he's telling stories, he usually separates everything into different sections, and he does that here. Because here, it starts off with Jesus shows up, and only Peter, James, and John, and Jairus and his wife go in. But then there are all these people in the house, like, which is it? It's because Luke separates it out for narrative purposes. If you read through Acts, he does this all the time. And so we kind of jump in time when Luke is telling a story. That's just the way he does it. It's all through his gospel. It's all through Acts. It's just the way he writes. So Jesus puts them all out and says, hey, she's not dead, she's just asleep. And they all know she's dead. In all the accounts, it is agreed. This child, she died. She legitimately died. There's no coma here. Everybody knows that she's dead. All the gospel writers go out of her way to tell us that. The crowd can't go in. Why can't they go in? Why? Because God works through faith. They don't have faith. Only the people who've got this, and because Jesus is not about the spectacle, right? Jesus doesn't do miracles just to do them. It's not an arbitrary display of power. There's a purpose behind it. And so he puts them out because you can be a part of the crowd and not have faith in Jesus. You can show up to Jesus things and not have faith in him. It's not part of, the goal is not to be a part of the crowd. It's to be a disciple, to be a follower of Jesus. And we see here that we need to let Jesus define our authority, reality. We need to let Jesus define our reality. He says, hey, her death, this is not permanent. It's like she's asleep. That's what faith is telling you. And they laugh But we need to let Jesus define our reality. We need to listen to what he says about who we are and listen to what he says about what we need to be doing and to what our mindset needs to be and what our behavior needs to be. Jesus, remember, he's got total and unique authority, so we need to take our cues from him, regardless of what the circumstances are doing. Now, another interesting truth that we see here, and maybe you've picked up on this already, is that sin can't make Jesus unclean. Because what does he do? He touches this girl. He takes her by the hand. What did he do? This woman with the issue of blood, she touched him. Now that should make him unclean. To handle a corpse by Jewish law would make you unclean. But sin can't make Jesus unclean. Jesus makes us clean. He made this little girl clean. He brought her back to life. He made this woman who had been bleeding for 12 years clean because she came into his presence. We can't tarnish or blemish Jesus with our sin. Our sin doesn't affect him. He affects our sin. He cleans us. He gives us new life. He shed his blood on the cross to pay the penalty for sin, and he rose again on the third day. The tomb is empty. That is a testimony of history and all of the first Christians in Acts that Jesus is alive. And because of that finished work, Jesus makes us clean. He is holy. He is perfectly pure. We cannot sully him. He cleans us. And he raised this girl back to life. Why? Because he has authority over death itself. And this is a foreshadowing to the cross and the resurrection. He has authority over sickness that no doctor can cure. He has authority over even a legion of demons that might come against him. He has authority over the things we are the most scared of, the storms. He's got authority over it all, and he alone has this unique authority. Now, for us as modern day believers, how do we apply this other than understanding more about who Jesus is? I think our application is found in that faith is the difference maker. Jesus told Jairus, don't be afraid, only believe. This woman who crawls through this crowd to get to Jesus is crawling on faith. She's risking everything on faith. Faith is the difference maker. Many of us are familiar with an individual named George Mueller. He's no longer alive. He lived in the 19th century. He's originally from Germany, but he moved to England, and he's most known for opening up orphanages to care for the orphans in England. But the way he did it was unique. He refused to do any kind of fundraising. He refused to solicit funds from anybody. He even refused to publish what he needed to continue in ministry. He resolved that he would only pray. And he wouldn't tell anybody. He would just pray for what he needed, and he would wait for God to supply him. And he did this on purpose to demonstrate to believers of that day that God is faithful and we can rely on him. And faith for the Christian works. I'm going to read an excerpt from his journal. This is from the autobiography of George Mueller, which is a collection of journal entries from him. He writes this: if anyone thinks that on account of our trials of faith during this year, we have been disappointed in our expectations or discouraged in the work, my answer is that the very opposite is true. Such days were expected from the beginning. The chief end for which the institution was established is that the church would see the hand of God stretched out on our behalf in answer to prayer. Our desire, therefore, is not that we may be without trials of faith, but that the Lord would graciously support us in the trial, that we may not dishonor him by distrust. This way of living brings the Lord remarkably near. Morning by morning, he inspects our supplies that he may send help as it is needed. I have never had a greater awareness of the Lord's presence than when after breakfast, nothing was left for dinner. And then the Lord provided the dinner for more than 100 people. or when, after dinner, there was nothing for the tea, and yet the Lord provided the tea. All this without one single human being having been informed about our need. One thing is certain, we are not tired of doing the Lord's work in this way. George Mueller lived on faith. He proceeded on faith, and he did this over decades. And in his journal is story after story after story of God's provision, but it was never easy. And he describes times when he was overcome with worry and fear, but he always in those times fled back to faith, fled back to prayer, fled back to encouraging himself with God's promises from Scripture. And he proceeded on faith, and his life is a testimony to the faithfulness of our God. Faith is the difference maker. It's not about circumstances. Jesus has unique and total authority. And the way for us to proceed as believers is to put our faith completely on him and to cling to it, regardless of our circumstances and our situations and the things that might happen to us. Because Jesus, and he alone, is worthy of our complete and total faith.